Our trip to France took us through Frankfurt, and our first stop was in beautiful Beaulieu-sur-Mer on the French Riviera. It turned out to be a great place to start our vacation. The scenery was absolutely stunning. We spent the first few days just walking around Beaulieu-sur-Mer, and everywhere we went we saw the beautiful Mediterranean Sea with all its various colors, and it was dotted with ships and yachts and boats of all sizes from all over the world, I'm sure. The scenery from all of the places that we walked was absolutely amazing. The buildings in the area were all of stone, and the walkways along the sea were absolutely beautiful. There was even a few statues that we took pictures of beside as well, as you can see here. Motorcycles and motor scooters seem to be a popular form of transportation, and they were parked on most of the side streets. After a few days in Beaulieu-sur-Mer, we took a trip up to a small village high above Beaulieu-sur-Mer, Ez Village. We stopped at a stone church area on the way up and had a picnic lunch as we made our way up to the top. The roadways and so on, as you can see here, were gravel and stone, but once we reached the top up to Ez Village, we discovered quite an amazing place. It had a lot of cactuses growing and in the area, and lots of stone buildings that we could walk through, the narrow passageways. But once we reached the very top, you could see from there some amazing scenery shots from down below. And then after our day trip up there, we did head back later in the day back to Nice, where we also discovered some really amazing scenery once again. We came across the Rothschilds' home, which was a huge place, and there were tours available so that you could go inside after you looked at the gardens on the outside. The rooms inside were decorated as they were when the Rothschild family either stays there or did stay there, and it was very opulent, as you can see. Outside the area there were lots of gardens and fountains and so on. A beautiful place to spend some time, I'm sure. The next day we took a trip over to Monaco, which is very close to Beaulieu-sur-Mer. We drove past the famous casino but decided not to go in, as we really didn't have the money to drop there. We did take a trip up to the palace where Princess Grace lives with her husband Prince Rainier. And after that we had a tour of the Rio Rita yacht, which is owned by a Greek magnate. This is the boat that Prince Charles and other members of the royal family often take their vacations on when in the Mediterranean. And it was really interesting to see how the other half really lives. The next day we took the train to Avignon and picked up our car and eventually made our way to Arles. The hotel was lovely and our room was very comfortable. The next morning we got up and had a quick breakfast at 9:30 or so because it was market day in Arles and we wanted to go out and check it out. It was very colorful during the market and you could buy anything there that you could imagine. Sunglasses, clothes, food, everything was really well priced. We spent the rest of the day walking around in the heat, and man, it was hot. However, we wanted to take a number of photographs of the city, so we walked the narrow roads, climbed a few stairs, and took a lovely bunch of photographs of the buildings and the things that we saw around the city. It was really a nice experience. But the next day we had to get ready, pack up, because we were heading off to a place called Con-Minevois, and we had a little picnic lunch on the way before we made our way to the new town. We had a little trouble finding our new place, but eventually we did, and we managed to get everything unpacked from our car and sit down with a little time to enjoy some bread, cheese, and a little bit of wine. It was Diane's birthday the next day, and before we left, I had booked a reservation at a place called the Hotel d'Alibert. We were able to enjoy a lovely dinner for Diane's birthday before going home and having a good sleep. The next morning after breakfast, we were heading to Carcassonne, which was a stone fortress built in 952 AD. It was absolutely an amazing place. As we walked around the outside and the inside, snapping photos like crazy. It would have been an amazing place to stay because they did have some accommodation inside the walls, but that wasn't going to be on this trip, so perhaps another time when we come back to visit there again, as I'm sure we will. After leaving Carcassonne, we had to make our way to Toulouse, where we were to meet our friends Jeff and Donna. We did have time for breakfast the next morning before we headed out on our way to our first cottage that we had rented, one of 6 cottages in France on the website. It was in the village of Amber. The scenery on the way was really quite something, and we stopped several times to take some pictures before we arrived at the small village where our cottage was located. It was very comfortable on the inside, and we settled in really quickly. The temperatures outside were extremely hot, but the house was made of stone, so it made it very cool inside if we kept the doors and the shutters closed. We did get outside to do a little cooking, however, even though it was very hot. And the one day we took a little trip up to one of the nearby lakes that the local people would go to when they wanted to get some relief. The next morning we got up fairly early and decided we would take a trip to the city of Albi to see the Toulouse-Lautrec Museum. It was a 63-kilometer drive through the countryside, and we stopped and took quite a number of pictures before arriving there. We did go inside a couple of the cathedrals that were in Albi because they were really quite spectacular before heading off to the Toulouse-Lautrec Museum, where we enjoyed looking at a number of his original artwork that were hanging on the walls in the museum. Later, we found a nice, comfortable place in the shade to enjoy some beverages and a quite light lunch. After lunch, we took some time to walk through some of the narrow alleyways of the city and take some photographs of things that we saw. In particular, we were taken with some of the flowers and the garden areas that were on display, and we got a chance to walk around down amongst the flowers and really quite enjoyed seeing all the color. We then made our way back to our cottage in Amber to enjoy some of the events that we had been doing while we settled in there. In particular, we learned how to play boules. So we went down to the local area where the people in the village played, and we had a few games down there. Later on, we took to doing some painting, as Jeff had decided that he would go out and get some paint and canvas. And we did sit around in our backyard and quite enjoyed doing that, something that I had never done before. Soon, with the heat, it was time to close up the shutters and spend time inside our stone cottage to maintain our cool. When we had been in Albi, we had seen a poster advertising an Elton John concert at the Montalban Jazz Festival. So we did go up there and managed to get tickets, and we had front row seats and enjoyed an amazing concert by Elton John. The next day was a bit of a lazy day, so we decided just to take a drive around the area and some of the small villages that were near Amber and take some photographs of some of the buildings that we saw. It gave us a chance to see what life was like living in some of these small villages. They were extremely well taken care of. The residents had planted many flowers along the way, and it was obvious that they had a great deal of pride in the place that they lived in. We had spotted a golf course on one of our day trips, and Jeff decided that this would be a good time to go and give the links a try in France, and he offered to be a caddy. So we headed off and played 18 holes at one of the local golf courses in the heat. Before returning home, as I discovered it was his 50th birthday, and we had a celebration in the backyard where we cooked up and barbecued a special dinner, and we had managed to pick up a couple of interesting gifts to give him for his 50th birthday. We kind of slept in the next day and decided to make that just a day trip around the area. Our ultimate goal was to reach the town of Courdes-sur-Ciel, but along the way we stopped in a variety of villages to take some photographs. We went into a couple of the buildings and churches that were along the way as well. And in one of the villages we discovered that they had just recently been a part of the Tour de France. And there were some bicycles that had been put out on display to celebrate the tour. And during that time we stopped for a lunch in one of the small villages before heading on to Courdes-sur-Ciel. The village of Courdes-sur-Ciel was a fortified hill town just north of Albi. And when we arrived, we noticed it came close to Carcassonne in its splendor. The town was very steep, and the walk up the narrow streets took almost 40 minutes before we got to the top. There were artisan shops along the way, and many photo opportunities presented themselves. We watched a glass blower practicing his craft in the heat, and then took to the streets again to take a few more photographs as the day went along. We came across a number of buildings with some very interesting door knockers that Diane took some photographs of. And in fact, we have some of them framed in our house right at the moment on the wall. At the end of a long day, we found a shady place to enjoy a light meal before we headed for home, because tonight we were going to have to pack up because we'd be leaving the next morning for our second cottage. We enjoyed one more evening before we reluctantly said goodbye to our cottage in Amber and prepared to head off for our new one. Our new home was in the village of Roussan. We had been warned ahead of time that the roadway up to the cottage entrance was narrow, and it certainly was, but we managed to get the car up there with about an inch to spare on either side, and we were able to unload and get settled into our new cottage. This cottage too was made of stone, which was really welcome as the heat was still rather intense, but we were able to stay inside the stone cottage and remain rather cool. Then later in the evening we had our first rain in quite some time. We were quite excited, so we went outside to celebrate. I think normally Roussan would have been a fairly sleepy little village, but at this time of the year they were having their annual fete, which included their version of the running of the bulls. So we were able to witness that and even get a chance to buy a t-shirt that would commemorate our visit. Our first sojourn out from our village in Roussan was to the city of Nîmes, where we wanted to see some of the Roman structures that were built there. So one of the ones that we did want to get into was the Roman amphitheater. Apparently it's the third largest that was built by the Romans, but it is one of the best preserved in the area. It would have been a fabulous sight to watch the gladiators fight in this amphitheater during the time. After visiting the amphitheater, we did spend some time getting cool in some of the shade areas around Nîmes. It was a beautiful city to visit with fountains and streams running through. And we even managed to find an area where the locals under the tall shade trees were playing boules. And boy, they certainly put us to shame as they were extremely good. One of the things that we wanted to do on the trip was to kayak under the famous Pont de Garde. We stopped in the small town of Collet where we rented our kayaks to go down the Pont de Garde. The heat was still pretty intense and we saw lots of people along the shoreline sunning and bathing. And at one point we did stop and get out of our canoes and had a dip into the cool water as the site of the bridge came into view. The trip itself was a little over 8 kilometers in length, and it took us about 2.5 hours to complete, and it turned out to be one of the real highlights of the trip so far. It was amazing to go underneath the bridge that had built by the Romans so many years ago as an aqueduct. Upon returning home, we enjoyed a nice dinner in the late evening before heading to bed, as the next day we were off to an area called the Camargue. The Camargue is a wildlife refuge on the Mediterranean Sea. They are known down there to raise the bulls used in local bullfights, as well as the horses that are used in those fights as well. We were able to see these bulls and the horses along the route, as well as a number of birds that were in the area. The only regret about the trip was I got a €35 parking ticket. The next day it was time to leave our cottage in Roussan. Jeff and Donna were going home, and we managed to get our car through the narrow streets and drop them off in Toulouse to take their flight home before we dropped off our car and headed off on the train to Lyon. We were only going to be in Lyon for one day, so we tried to pack in as much as we could. We enjoyed the market, as each one of the markets are a little bit different, but they are always very colorful. Then we took some time to meander around the city, across some of the bridges, and looked at some of the gigantic buildings that were along the riverside. There was one area that we did want to visit. It was an area called the Traboules, which was a series of covered passageways that had been built years ago to transport silk from one area of the city to another. We were able to go on a tour with 2 or 3 other people and really enjoyed the experience. After a light lunch, the rest of the day we spent meandering around the city and taking in more of the sights, as we were going to be catching a train the next day from Lyon up to Paris, which would be our last stop on our trip this time around. The next morning we boarded the TGV train from the Lyon station heading to Paris, and we had a lovely car that we were in, and we were able to watch all of the scenery as we went by.